Shades of Autumn. A short horror story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by McConnell. It was some time around the second week of April that Julian began turning green. At first, he said it had started as a rash, a bunch of broken capillaries in his hands and on his forearms that spread in spidery networks across his skin. At first, he'd hardly noticed. On his pale, virtually translucent skin, the veins often showed up as a roadmap of overlapping lines, standing out starkly in shades of pale blue. But this, the odd, greenish tinge like the shadow of a fading bruise, was different. At first, we tried to explain it away. Clearly it was either stress, paint, or a reaction to them both. The first of these factors, the impact of stress, was a common problem for Julian. We all knew he had a big exhibit coming up, that the pressure on him to produce was building, and that on each previous occasion when he'd been under that sort of stress, the lack of sleep, creeping anxiety, and overindulgence in alcohol had manifested itself physically. One time it was irritable bowel syndrome, the streaks of crimson he found on the tissue when he went to the bathroom scaring him senseless and only serving to increase his anxiety. Another time it was migraines, crippling headaches that would not be subdued by the usual painkillers and which would be accompanied by spots of colour floating into his field of vision, the pain rendering him unable to work, which once again only served to increase his anxiety. On almost every occasion he would enter his studio ready to work at a reasonable weight and come out just before the big show looking emaciated, as if he'd eaten virtually nothing the entire time he was working, so that the only thing he managed to feed was his anxiety. In every case, the symptoms of his anxiety eventually became causes of anxiety themselves, self-fulfilling prophecies in twists of vicious cycles. On previous occasions, the doctors, of course, recommended rest. In the short term, he needed sleep and stress reduction, and in the long term, an environment devoid of stress and pressure. Unfortunately for Julian, as an artist who only got paid for the work that he sold, an environment with a lack of stress and pressure was also an environment with a lack of payment. Rest in the short term meant poverty and starvation in the long term. Of course, less sympathetic friends would claim that the solution was obvious: give up being an artist and get a so-called proper job. It was a solution that Julian not only considered, but actually tried out a few times, attempting on several occasions to get other, more normal jobs. He spent several months working as a barista in a local coffee shop and even once took a job as a teller at a bank. Again, though, his anxiety got the better of him. For Julian, customer-facing roles in which he was called upon to speak to strangers were torture, his nerves threatening to turn him inside out every time he had to interact with someone. He would get cold sweats, panic attacks, and would sometimes simply walk off shift without explanation when it all got too much, which of course wasn't good for his long-term career progression. He tried freelance work, jobs he could pick up online and which would not involve dealing with people. Whilst the jobs he did get worked well for him in terms of the work required, they did not pay well, meaning that the money required, chiefly to pay for things like food and rent, meant this solution didn't work either. The jobs were less stressful, sure, but the pressure on his finances increased his anxiety almost as much as the jobs requiring interaction. So he went back to his art. At least with painting he was stress-free for the majority of time. For each painting he sold, he would make the equivalent to 2 months of pay from either of the other job paths he explored, which meant in the time between exhibits, when he wasn't required to actually sell anything and was free to just work on his art, he was stress-free and healthy. So he continued to paint. He once explained this decision by comparing himself to a surfer. When painting, he could enjoy the times when the sea was calm and flat, and prepare himself mentally and physically for the times when the anxiety would peak and crest, and the time to submit his work approached. When I pointed out that surfers hated calm water and actually enjoyed riding the big waves, he just shrugged. "I tried things the normal way," he said. "This isn't perfect, but it is better." That day in April, around 3 weeks from the opening of his new exhibit, I could see that he was beginning to climb the crest of a new wave. Not yet so stressed that he would really feel it, but anxious enough to feel the deadline looming like a dark cloud over him, the weight of the pressure pushing so hard onto his shoulders that, inexplicably, it turned him green. When he first walked into the cafe that day, I assumed that the strange tint was a result of the paint he had been using, or perhaps a trick of the light caused by the layer of terps and linseed oil that permanently permeated his skin. On closer inspection, however, it was clear that the color was below the surface of the skin, and was only apparent because of how pale Julian was otherwise. Having noticed it in the first few minutes, and worried that it could be some kind of contamination or poisoning related to components in his paint, I didn't waste any time in addressing the strange tinge, and asked him about it directly. He said that he had noticed it, but that he wasn't particularly worried. "I like green," he said, as if the transformation was the most normal thing in the world. It was a strange quirk of Julian's already strange character that, whilst he was terrified of things like talking on the phone or speaking to cashiers in the supermarket, things like turning a completely different colour didn't bother him in the slightest. It started, he said, a week or two earlier, first as a rash and then as slightly raised dots on his skin. He assumed it was something to do with what he was eating and mentioned something about flamingos turning pink because of the shrimp they eat. I pointed out that this wasn't normal, and that unless he was eating more grass than a particularly ravenous field full of cows, his food should not be turning him green. He nodded in non-committal agreement and tried to drop the subject. It was only when I insisted and made him promise that he agreed to visit a doctor. "If it still looks like this in a week, then I'll go see the doctor. It's just, I've got a lot of work to do at the moment, finding the time, you know?" I shook my head and sighed. Had this been one of my other friends gradually changing colour, then I would have been surprised by their reluctance to visit the doctor. But this was Julian. As long as he got to paint uninterrupted, his new Bruce Banner tan was a concern for later. For him, it just wasn't a top priority. By the time I visited him a week later, though, it had become a far more pressing issue. Julian and I had been friends for many years, and by now it was almost tradition that in the final weeks before any big project, I would turn up to check on him, just to make sure he did other non-painting things like bathing and remembering to eat. Turning up to his studio with takeaway pizzas and boxes of cereal for the next morning, I let myself in, and was surprised to find my friend not before his easel as expected, but rather at the back of the studio, his t-shirt pulled up to shoulder height as he examined himself closely in the full-length mirror. There was a lot to examine. Catching one look at him, I dropped the pizzas heavily to the floor and rushed instead to the telephone. Within an hour, Julian, despite his protests, was in the back of an ambulance and on his way to the hospital. When he was taken into the examination room, Julian asked that I be allowed to accompany him, lying to the nurse and claiming that I was his brother. I followed Julian and the doctor into the room and will admit that I was a little unnerved by the way that even the nurses, like the paramedics before them, shrank back from him. Though, in retrospect, I suppose it was understandable. Walking in on Julian that afternoon had been quite a shock. Whereas the previous week he had displayed only a strange green tinge to his skin, now he was transformed. Across large areas of his body he had developed large pendulous appendages. polyps that had, he said, begun as dark green skin tags, like warts or pimples, but which over the course of a week had swollen until they were each the size of a grape, though with the colour, shape, and leathery texture of a small avocado. They hung across the surface of his body, dozens from his fingers, a dozen from the ridges of his eyebrows, so that they dangled before his eyes, obscuring his vision. From his ribs and back, scores of these tiny nodules sprouted from his skin, hanging, bloated and swollen by their tapered, pear-like ends. How or why he had allowed the growths to get to this point was beyond me. All he would say was that he was busy, that he was doing some amazing work and that really he hadn't noticed. This I took to be a lie, especially as I had walked in on him examining himself in the mirror. Clearly, he had noticed. He had simply chosen not to do anything about it, to put it off for a while whilst he continued with his work. There are few things in life more disconcerting than presenting your symptoms to a medical professional and having them recoil open-mouthed at the sight of you. That experience would be bad enough for someone without anxiety. For Julian, it was tantamount to receiving a death sentence, and it took me almost 15 minutes to calm him down. Initially, the doctor was concerned that Julian's condition might be contagious and wanted to shoo me out of the room, but I refused. If it, whatever it was, happened to be contagious, then it was too damn late by now anyway, I insisted. Plus, I was not leaving Julian alone to cope with this, no matter what happened. Seeing that I was not going to move on this, he eventually folded and allowed me to stay, following along and holding my friend's hand whilst he was first examined, then tested, then admitted. Whilst we remained alone in the doctor's tiny office room, preliminary tests were performed on Julian's strange growths. Having determined that despite their strange colour they were composed of skin tissue, and through tests for bacteria, fungus, and viruses they were likely not contagious, the doctor returned to say that Julian would need to remain under observation whilst they established exactly what was going on. This, of course, elicited a great protest from Julian, who insisted that he had work to do and that time was running out. In the end, though, my insistence, backed by the doctor's, was both more aggressive and more final than his, the result being that he was moved to a small room which, whilst it was not technically an isolation area, was a good distance from any other patient and clearly chosen by the staff for its privacy. Julian was given a hospital bed, a revealingly backless gown, and was hooked up to a drip to combat what the doctor called acute dehydration. I had expected, with the worry about his condition, not to mention his misplaced concern about the time missed from painting, that Julian might be massively wired and unable to sleep. In fact, the exact opposite was true. No sooner had his head hit the pillow in the hospital bed than he had fallen into a deep slumber, leading me to suspect that this might be the first time he had actually laid down in days. I, meanwhile, remained awake all night, though it was not until the early hours of the morning that I began to notice the change, and rushed to alert one of the nurses. Around 4:30 a.m., I noticed a thin trickle of blood streaming down the left side of Julian's head. Alarmed by the fact that he was bleeding, I rose from my chair and saw immediately that the strange growths, particularly those hanging above Julian's eyebrows, had begun to detach, leaving small, leaking wounds around the size of a 5-pence piece behind them. Whilst this odd fact seemed not to faze the nurse, the sudden, abrupt drop in Julian's blood pressure did, and, to my alarm, he was rushed from the room and off to some other undisclosed location, whilst I was left to simply sit and wait. Over the course of the next 24 hours, 74 plum-sized growths, each of which had expanded in size whilst Julian had been in the hospital, simply fell from Julian's body. Some detached with hardly a mark, whilst others left wounds so large that they required a stitch to close. All of which is not to mention the fact that when Julian was finally returned to the room, I was told that he had required a transfusion, each of the growths having leached a small but not inconsiderable amount of blood from him before they simply fell away. Not that these procedures left Julian sick or even badly affected. He stayed in the hospital for what amounted to a total of 3 days, and by the time he left, he seemed to be in better health than I had seen him in for years. In fact, despite sporting so many small plasters all over the surface of his body that he looked like he'd been in the world's worst shaving accident, he positively bounded out of the place with the energy of a small puppy, insisting over and over that he felt amazing and that he should probably come for transfusions a little more often. He had received few answers from the doctors when they had told him that his growths would need to be sent away for tests. When I asked if he would be okay, now that he was 5 days behind schedule with his work, he just smiled broadly. "I have it all under control," he beamed. "I dunno, maybe it was getting some rest, or I dunno, but everything seems really clear now. Like a fog's lifted or something. I know exactly what I need to do, and I feel like I have tons of time to get it done. I'm healthy, I'm relaxed, I don't know, I feel great." He literally laughed these final words, and I had to admit, seemed almost to glow as he shook my hand and pulled me in for a hug, thanking me over and over for sticking with him and making sure he was okay. I said no problem, and he kissed me on the cheek. "Okay," he said finally as we reached the door of his studio. "Once more into the breach. This is going to be good, mate. I can feel it." With that, he disappeared inside. I didn't see him again for almost a month. When I did see Julian again, it was at the launch of his exhibit. The show had opened to quite some fanfare, with great reviews and multiple sales of large pieces. In some ways, it was stunning that he had managed to produce so much work in such a short period of time. Clearly, he had been inspired. More surprising even than his success, however, was the marked change in his appearance. Julian looked like a new man. His scars had healed, he seemed to have gained weight in the form of muscle, as if he'd been furiously working out for the past year, never mind the last month. His skin looked clear and tan, his hair healthy and lustrous. Had I not known better, and had it not been physically impossible, I would have said he had a glow similar to that sometimes observed in pregnant women, which it turned out was a somewhat ironic comparison. Following the night of his opening, during which I saw him only briefly as he was required to mingle and circulate amongst the guests, something which he seemed to do with uncharacteristic confidence, Julian seemed to simply disappear. For the next 3 months, I heard not a single word from him. My other friends assured me that he was probably just working, locked away in his studio and up to his eyeballs, immersed in some new project. Other, less kind friends explained that Julian was a success now, that he had made a fortune from his last exhibit, had made new, rich, and important friends, and would probably never be seen with the likes of us again. This I found hard to believe. I called his phone, visited his studio, and even contacted his parents to ask after him, but was met with silence. Nobody had seen or heard from him in months. Then, one night in August, and seemingly out of the blue, I received a phone call asking me to meet him at his studio, to come along and to please hurry. I know that some would have balked at the idea, become angry or spiteful about their friend's absence and sudden need for attention, but that's not how things worked with us. It didn't matter to me that I hadn't seen him and that he hadn't called. What was important was that he needed me now. Without a moment's thought, I dropped my other plans and made my way there. Walking into the studio, I was struck by how intensely crowded the place was. Canvases covered every surface, piled and stacked in such a way that weaving through them was like being a giant weaving its way through the skyscrapers of some tiny city. Eventually, having wound my way through this maze of artwork, I found my friend. He was hunched, his back to me, a blanket draped over his shoulders and covering his head. Hearing my footsteps as I approached, he called for me to stop and wait. My first thought was that he had relapsed, that the same strange affliction that had befallen him months earlier had returned and that he would once again need to be rushed to the hospital. The last part of this assumption turned out to be true, though actually convincing him to go was another matter. As for his condition, there were no further growths, at least not of the kind we had seen before. This time, things were different. As he turned around to face me, it was clear that Julian was falling apart, literally. His skin, for want of a better word, had fractured. Across his face, bare chest and arms, the skin had hardened into large, scale-like plates, most of which burned in shades of red, amber, and yellow, like some kind of solid flame. In other places, toward the edge of each scale, the colour deepened to a deep umber, and then a chalky, almost ashen black. Around him on the bed, flakes of this skin, each the size of an outstretched hand, lay in brown, brittle piles that crumbled to dust when he moved. Worse still were the empty spaces, places and gaps where the skin was simply missing. Here it was possible to look right through, to see the bone beneath, and how it too had taken on a different hue, darkened to a rich nut brown. I remember that my eyes filled with tears, and I rushed forward to hold him, but he stopped me, the act of raising his hand sending fragments of what had once been skin splintering onto the bed. "Joan," he said, with obvious difficulty. "You can't help me," he moaned, each word mangled by his inability to form the sounds, the lips being pinned back as if dried onto the teeth like a thin film of gold leaf. I stood, hands dangling limp by my sides, my head shaking side to side, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Turning to face me, lidless eyes rolling wildly in his head, Julian attempted to smile, and before he collapsed said only a single word. "Autumn," he whispered gently. Then he folded forward, asleep. It took me almost 5 minutes to wake him. When he came round, I told him not to worry, that an ambulance was on its way, but he insisted, screaming and wailing as if in agony, that I cancel the call, which I eventually, reluctantly did. With a strained, laboured movement, he pointed to an upturned crate that he had clearly been using as a makeshift table, and to a letter that had been placed there. Lifting it, I read it several times, unable to fully comprehend what had been written. The letter was from the hospital, requesting that Julian make his way there as soon as possible. Evidently, tests on the growths removed from him had shown some extraordinary and unprecedented results. According to what was written, each growth was in fact something approaching a sac, inside of which, according to the doctors, there were around a dozen smaller fragments, which were best described as seeds. Indeed, our tests seem to indicate that these smaller pieces contain almost 60% chlorophyll. As Julian moaned, I continued to read, skipping past the doctor's insistence that he return to the hospital immediately to the more ominous final sentences, the ones stating that they were watching closely because these seeds had begun to sprout. As I turned back toward my friend, who had in the short time I had been there withered even further, the reds and yellows began darkening and fading into brown. I watched as in minutes his muscles began to atrophy, seeming to slough and melt from the bone like leaves, falling red from the trees and rotting, trodden underfoot to a thick, oozing mulch. Like autumn, I thought. I saw that again he was gesturing, this time not to the table but the paintings, dozens of them arranged around the room, some in hues of green, others in shades of russet and rust, the burnished colours of the fall. On the easel, centre stage and clearly placed there for some significant reason, was an image almost as terrifying as it was surreal. It depicted a man, arms outstretched in a pose reminiscent of Leonardo's Vitruvian Man. One side of the figure, however, was not flesh and bone, but rather bark. Where there should have been an arm, there was instead a stretching length of twigs, branches, and leaves. Leaves that in a second image toward the centre of the canvas had begun, with the turn of the seasons, to die and rot, falling after a final flourish to piles of mulch below. A man, a person, a human being, cycling like the trees with the changing of the seasons, the green tint of spring, the flowering and seeding, the robust health of summer, and now, "What the hell is happening?" I shouted, turning back to where the remnants of my friend, skeletal and terrified, lay upon the bed. Staring up at me, wide-eyed and desperate, Julian pointed downward, down toward the legs, concealed by the blanket, and nodded for me to pull it back. Swallowing hard, I gripped the fabric and slowly revealed what lay below. Seeing not what should have been, a pair of legs and feet, but instead a writhing network of long, tenebrous roots. Seeing not what should have been, a pair of legs and feet, but instead a writhing network of long, tenebrous roots. I think I may have screamed. I may have shrieked in confusion and in terror, but eventually that subsided, and I realized that my friend, my true, close and unfortunate friend, was trying as best as he could to speak. Through lips that were almost no longer there, he hissed gently his final whispered wish, each syllable a long, agonized exhalation. "Bury me. Please, please, bury me. No, not when I die. Now, bury me now. Please, please." I don't know if I screamed, but I do know that I cried. The next day, up on the moor, the grassy expanse high above the town, I buried my best friend. Alive. I carried him, light as a feather, brittle and fragile, from the studio and placed him, still wrapped in the blanket, onto the back seat of my car, scared that he might shatter or disintegrate on the way. Then I drove up to the moor and dug a hole, all the while hearing him thank me, saying over and over again that he loved me and that it was okay. Seasons change. Seasons change. Finally, as the sun began to rise, and as he continued slowly to nod, I placed him gently into the pit and covered his body with earth, watching as I did tiny, tubular roots, thin tendrils like strands of hair, spread and reach into the soil, searching and scouring for anchor and purchase. I watched him as his eyes, white and round, stared directly up into the endless blue of the sky, and as what remained of his body went limp and still. Had he died, I wondered, or simply given himself up? Had he somehow taken root? I crossed myself, told him I loved him, and with one heavy shovelful of earth covered his face in dirt. trying as I did to reassure myself that I was burying my friend and not planting him. For 5 long months I visited that spot every day. I watched the ground harden with cold, watched the frost and snow cover the crime, only to thaw and show beneath new, persistent shoots of grass. It was only in March, almost a year since Julian had shown that strange green tinge, that something below the soil's surface began to shift and stir. A new shoot, ripe and green, pushed with purpose through the ground and out into the world above. For almost a month I watched it grow, rapidly from a shoot to a stem, then to a sapling, young but strong, filled in spring with potential and sap. At that point, I'd seen enough. Exactly what happened to Julian I doubt I'll ever know. I've read a bunch of theories. Greek myths of Daphne, who, pursued by Apollo, prayed for her father to save her by turning her into a laurel tree. I wondered what, if anything, was chasing Julian. By what did he feel so pursued that he would ever have prayed for this? I read on the net about strange experiments, gene splicing and grafting, about how you can fix a limb from one fruit tree to another and the branch will continue to grow. Fruiting lemons, pears, or apples from the trunk of an orange tree. I read how this process was prized for military applications and how governments have tried to produce this effect in a number of human subjects, so far without success. I heard as well of the cordyceps fungus that sprays its spores into ants and wasps, taking root beneath the skin, penetrating the brain and finally controlling the mind. This fungus forces an ant to climb ever upward and cling to a branch as high as it can and wait until the fungus, growing through its flesh, sprouts through the top of the head and feeds on what remains. I read a lot of theories, but not a lot of answers. The contents of Julian's studio, all 90 paintings with their odd botanical twists, sold through his agent to private collectors in the months following his disappearance, all of them selling for far more than Julian would ever have earned when he was alive. All, that is, but one. The final piece that rested on the easel I took the same day I buried him and kept for my own collection, not because I liked to look at it, but because I hoped that one day it might help me understand, to make some sense of how my friend, like some strange tree in a species far removed from man, felt the seasons shift and change, crumpled and rotted, shedding his leaves as autumn gave way to winter. In truth, I shouldn't have taken the painting. It isn't like I needed it. The image it held I could see any time, burnt as if branded onto my eyes and mind. In the top quarter, a man slowly becoming a tree. In the second, that tree half shedding and losing its leaves. In the third, reduced, as Julian had been, to pulp, detritus, debris, and dust. I could also see, whenever I closed my eyes, the final quarter, nestled in that bottom corner, that painting of a strange and twisted plant, a seedling peeping up through the ground, a sapling that in place of a branch had sprouted instead a chubby, reaching cylinder of flesh, the tiny digits and pearl drop nails of a baby's tiny arm. A month ago I moved away, packed my things and took a plane. I got a job in a far-off city on the other side of the world, a place where I intend to live out my days in a land that has no seasons. This has been Shades of Autumn, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2023 by Michael van der Voort. Production copyright by Michael van der Voort.